Whereas if we have run for an hour or trained hard, high intensity training, and we haven't quite reached the beginning of our so-called feeding window, will eating a small amount of food take us out of that fast? Well, depends on what the food is. If it's mostly fat, probably not. A number of people out there nowadays talk about so-called fat fasting. Fat fasting is a way to kind of wriggle past the stringency of either eating or not eating as a black and white rule for feeding window versus non-feeding window. So some people will ingest medium chain triglycerides, so-called MCTs, or people will ingest fats only until their official feeding window begins. So these are sort of how the negotiations that people carry out tend to go. But fat, of course, won't increase blood glucose and insulin as much as carbohydrates will. Protein will have sort of an intermediate effect. And as I mentioned earlier, ingesting carbohydrates with some fat will tend to blunt the rise in glucose and will extend the duration over which glucose is released. So we really can't say food X or beverage X breaks a fast. However, at the extremes we can say that. For instance, if you drink a can of soda pop, unless you just ran an ultra marathon, you're breaking your fast. Okay? You eat a piece of pizza, you're breaking your fast. If you eat purely fats, maybe, probably not, if you've been fasting for 5 hours or more, strictly fasting for 5 hours or more. So you can start to see where there's a lot of wiggle room, and it's very contextual. And this is why any post that you see or any information that you see that something does or does not break your fast, that doesn't place it in the context of when the last time you ate and what you ate and your activity and your time within the circadian clock schedule of 24 hours, it's a sort of meaningless discussion. So in general, I think what's really useful, if you're not going to wear a continuous glucose monitor, is to try and be fairly strict about when you initiate your feeding window and when you stop your feeding window. And as time evolves and you establish a more regular routine of eating certain kinds of foods and not others that are right for you, because as I've emphasized before on this podcast, and I will continue to emphasize, keto works great for some people. Vegetarian keto works great for some people. Carnivore diet works great for other people. Some people are omnivores. Some people are carnivores. Some people are vegan. All of that is great and fine by me. Everyone has to establish what's right for them. Today, we've really bypassed the discussion about foods of a particular origin or type, animal-based or plant-based. But all the same rules apply within this thing that we're called intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding. So what breaks a fast will depend. And what you want to eat or what you are willing to eat, that's a totally separate manner from when you eat. But as we've established, when you eat is vitally important. Some of you are probably wondering whether or not artificial sweeteners or non-artificial plant-based sweeteners like stevia break a fast. This will vary somewhat, and I have to say the data on this are somewhat mixed. There is evidence that when people ingest artificial sweeteners, that it can create a transient increase in blood glucose followed by a transient decrease in blood glucose below baseline. This is thought to explain the increase in hunger caused by ingestion of things like aspartame and sucralose and things of that sort. There are not a lot of good studies exploring the plant-based non-sugar sweeteners, things like stevia, even things like monk fruit, which is a separate category unto itself. There aren't a lot of studies on this. I think most people need to establish this for themselves. The best way, of course, would be to wear a continuous glucose monitor, to go into a fasted state of either 1 hour or 2 hours, or maybe you've been fasting all night, and then ingest stevia in whatever form you want, or coffee in whatever form you want with sucralose or aspartame, etc., setting aside the discussion about the effects of these things on the gut microbiome, which is a different topic entirely. I think it's fair to say that in moderation, the plant-based non-sugar sweeteners like stevia, in particular stevia, seem to have a minimal impact on overall blood glucose when considered over a fairly large time bin. Aspartame and sucralose, do artificial sweeteners break a fast? Depends on the amount, depends on the type. And in general, I think you're probably okay, provided that you're not indulging in them too often.